I stand in the midst of the storms of history to tell you a story about how 500 knights faced 100,000 men, how a fortress on a small island became the last bastion of the Christian world, and how the Knights Hospitaller performed their greatest heroic deed, which forever inscribed their name in the books of history. This story is not just about a siege. It is a story about how a tiny Mediterranean island, Rhodes, became a symbol of hope for all of Christian Europe when the mighty Ottoman Empire struck it with full force one summer dawn. To begin the story, we must go back in time to understand how the Knights Hospitaller came to Rhodes in the first place. These knights, originally called the Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, were formed in Jerusalem during the time of the Crusades. At first, they only cared for the sick and pilgrims, but as Muslim forces increasingly pressed the Christians, they too took up arms. When the Crusaders definitively lost the Holy Land, the Hospitallers first settled in Cyprus and finally chose the island of Rhodes as their new home. Here, in the middle of the blue Aegean Sea, for more than 200 years, they built their fortifications and became the defenders of Christian navigation against Muslim pirates. The city of Rhodes was a magnificent fortification. Contemporaries said that the walls were so thick that 3 horses could have fit on them side by side. The bastions, which they built over decades, were so high that from the ships it looked as if mountains were rising from the sea. The harbor was guarded by 2 huge towers, between which a chain could be stretched, preventing enemy ships from entering. This was the pride of the Hospitallers, the fortress that many considered impregnable. The Grand Master of the Order, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, was already an old man when danger began to approach. He was past 60, but his mind was still sharp, and his body had been hardened in countless battles over the decades. Contemporaries wrote of him that he was like an old lion who was still able to protect his pack. In his youth, he was born in France, into a noble family, and devoted his entire life to the order. He knew that Rhodes's days were numbered, for in the distance sat on the throne a new, young, and extraordinarily ambitious sultan. Suleiman, who would later be called the Magnificent, had recently taken power from his father. He was 26 years old when he became sultan and immediately proved himself worthy of the title. He was young but already a brilliant strategist. In his first year, he conquered Belgrade, which until then had been considered the bastion of the Christian world. Then his attention turned to Rhodes. His grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, had once tried to conquer the island but failed. Suleiman swore that he would not fail. The Sultan assembled a huge army. According to estimates, 100,000 soldiers gathered, including janissaries who formed the elite infantry of the empire, and countless artillerymen who operated the Ottoman cannons. The Ottoman cannons were then among the most fearsome weapons in the world. They were huge monsters cast in bronze, capable of crushing even the strongest walls to dust. Suleiman ordered the best gun founders in the empire to make new, even larger cannons specifically for the siege of Rhodes. At the end of summer, news arrived in Rhodes. The spies of the Hospitallers, who lurked in Turkish ports, reported that a huge fleet was preparing to sail. Grand Master Philippe acted immediately. He summoned the full strength of the order. At that time, there were approximately 500 knights in Rhodes who came from various European countries. Among them were French, Spanish, English, Germans, Italians, and even Portuguese. Each of them swore to lay down his life in defense of the order. Beside them stood several thousand more local soldiers and armed citizens who undertook to defend the city. But even so, the balance of forces was hopeless. 500 knights and a few thousand defenders against 100,000 attackers. The knights knew this, and the weight of the decision showed on their faces. But no one spoke of surrender. Grand Master Philippe gathered them in the great council chamber, where the order had held its assemblies for centuries. "Brothers," began the Grand Master, and his voice echoed through the hall. "We know what awaits us. The Turkish Sultan, who has already conquered Belgrade, now comes to us. His fleet is enormous, his army endless. But we are not afraid, because we are not just defending a city. We are defending the last bastion of the Christian world in the Mediterranean. If Rhodes falls, The Turks will have an open path to Sicily, Italy, even to Rome itself. Therefore, we cannot retreat. Therefore, we cannot surrender, even if it costs us our lives." The knights listened in silence. Then, one by one, they all raised their swords. No words were needed. Everyone knew what this act meant. They swore to fight to the end, whether to victory or to death. If you have enjoyed this story so far and are curious about how this epic siege will continue, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and press the like button. This is the only way we can continue to uncover the greatest events of the Middle Ages. At the end of summer, on a hot August day, the Turkish fleet arrived. Chroniclers wrote that when the Rhodes Bay filled with sails, it looked as if the sea itself had turned into a white forest. 300 ships approached, and on each of them soldiers, cannons, supplies. The Hospitallers stood on the walls watching as the ships anchored and as Turkish soldiers disembarked on shore. The sight inspired fear even in the hearts of the most hardened knights, but no one showed it. Sultan Suleiman personally led the campaign. This was unusual because sultans usually did not participate personally in sieges. But Suleiman was young and ambitious. He wanted everyone to see. It was he who would conquer Rhodes, which his grandfather had failed to do. When he stepped ashore, he immediately had his ornate tent erected on a nearby hill, from which there was a good view of the city walls. The preparations for the siege lasted weeks. Turkish engineers dug trenches through which they could bring the cannons closer to the walls. They built watchtowers from which archers could shoot at the defenders on the walls. And what was most fearsome, they began to set up the huge cannons. These cannons were so large that each was pulled by several dozen oxen, and when they fired, the earth shook. Grand Master Philippe knew that the walls would not withstand the cannonade for long. Therefore, he chose a different strategy. He gave orders to build a second line of defense behind the walls from rubble, earth, anything they could find. So if the cannons broke through the stone walls, the defenders could still fight on the second line. In addition, he organized night raids. Small groups of knights and soldiers crept out of the city at night and tried to set fire to the Turkish gun emplacements or kill the engineers. These raids were initially successful. On one occasion, a group of French knights got so close to the Sultan's tent that they almost reached it. Panic broke out in the Turkish camp, and the Sultan's guards barely managed to protect him. But the Turks learned quickly. They strengthened the guard, and in the next raids, the defenders were no longer able to penetrate the defenses. At the beginning of October, the cannonade began. The great Turkish cannons, which had been set up with great care, began to bombard the city walls. Contemporaries wrote that the noise could be heard for miles. When a ball hit the wall, the whole city shook. Stones flew in all directions, and the defenders standing on the walls were constantly in danger. The Hospitallers responded with their own cannons, but they were much smaller and fewer than the Turkish ones. Still, every cannon shot counted. When a Turkish cannon fired, the Hospitaller cannons tried to fire back, hoping that perhaps they would hit an enemy cannon or powder magazine. Sometimes it worked. On one occasion, a Hospitaller cannonball hit a Turkish powder magazine, which exploded with a huge blast. Hundreds of Turks died, and the Sultan personally ordered that henceforth the powder magazines be placed farther away. As the weeks passed, the walls began to crumble. The cannons fired day and night, and although the Hospitallers constantly repaired the damage, they simply could not keep pace. Here and there a wall bastion collapsed, and the Turks immediately attacked. But the defenders repulsed them every time. The knights, in their heavy armor, stood on top of the rubble, and with their swords cut down the janissaries climbing up. These assaults were bloody and brutal. The janissaries, who had received the best training in the empire, fought with determination. But the Hospitallers also did not retreat. On one occasion, an English knight named John Buck single-handedly held rubble against an entire janissary platoon. Contemporaries wrote that he killed at least 20 janissaries before he was seriously wounded, and his companions dragged him back. But he survived, and a few weeks later he was fighting again. Grand Master Philippe personally walked the walls, encouraging the defenders. He was already old, but every day he was on the front line. When a bastion was in a particularly difficult situation, he was the first to go there to help. The knights and soldiers saw this and drew new strength from it. A contemporary chronicler wrote, "The Grand Master was like a torch in the darkness. Where he appeared, the courage of men doubled." But the Turkish pressure was constant. Sultan Suleiman would not tolerate failure. When the first assaults were repulsed, he sent even more soldiers. When the cannons did not seem effective enough, he had even larger ones brought in. One of his messengers, who returned from Constantinople, told the Sultan, "Lord, people are beginning to doubt. They say that the walls of Rhodes are impregnable." Suleiman angrily replied, "Then we will blow up the earth beneath them." And that is exactly what he did. Turkish engineers began to dig tunnels under the walls. These tunnels ran deep underground, and the goal was to reach directly to the foundations of the walls. There they filled them with gunpowder and blew them up. If successful, such an explosion could collapse an entire bastion. The Hospitallers soon discovered what the Turks were doing. They began to dig their own counter-tunnels. This was dangerous work. Knights and miners worked in dark, narrow tunnels by torchlight, always listening to hear if they could hear Turkish diggers. When two tunnels met underground, brutal close combat began in the darkness. These clashes were the most terrifying scenes of the siege. They fought with daggers, short swords, sometimes just bare hands, in tight spaces where one could barely move. On one occasion, an Italian knight named Giovanni led his team into a counter-tunnel. They met a Turkish team, and a desperate fight began. Giovanni himself killed 3 Turks before he was seriously wounded. His companions dragged him back, but the tunnel was lost. The Turks blew it up, and part of one bastion collapsed. By early December, the condition of the city had become critical. The walls were breached in several places, food was running out, and worst of all, the number of defenders was steadily decreasing. Every day, knights and soldiers died. The number of wounded exceeded 1,000, and in the hospital, where the order's doctors worked, there was barely any room left. Grand Master Philippe himself was wounded on one occasion when a Turkish ball exploded near him and he got shrapnel in his leg. But even so, he continued. The knights knew they could not hold out much longer. One day, Philippe convened the council. "Brothers," he said, and his voice sounded tired, "we have been fighting for 7 months. More than 2,000 of us have died. The walls are crumbling. Food is running out. But we are still here, and we still have not given up Rhodes." A Spanish knight named Garcia de Toledo stood up. "Grand Master, what can we do? The Turks are overwhelming. Every day more assaults. We cannot hold out forever." Philippe nodded. "I know, but the question is not how long we can hold out. The question is how history will remember us. We can surrender Rhodes and say we tried, or we can fight on and show the whole world that Christian knights never give up, even when there is no hope." Silence settled in the room. Then slowly, all the knights stood up. There was no need for a vote. The decision was made. During December, the Turks launched another massive assault. This time, they committed all their forces. The cannonade was so intense that the defenders could barely see through the dust and smoke. When the cannonade ended, thousands of janissaries stormed the walls from all sides. Suleiman personally watched the attack from his tent on the hill, and messengers constantly reported to him. The Hospitallers knew this was the decisive moment. If the Turks broke through, the city was lost. Grand Master Philippe committed all reserves. Even the wounded who could move were armed and sent to the walls. The battle lasted for hours. The knights and janissaries fought at close quarters, with daggers, swords, sometimes bare hands. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the ground turned red with blood, and the cries of the dying echoed from the walls. But when evening descended, the defenders still held the walls. The Turks withdrew, leaving 1,000 dead among the rubble. Sultan Suleiman was furious. They had been so close, and yet they had failed. But he did not give up. He ordered another assault for the next day, but it was no longer necessary. During the night, Grand Master Philippe made a difficult decision. He convened the council and told them, "Brothers, the time has come. We have been defending this city for more than 70 years. We have proven that the Hospitallers never run away. But now, if we continue to fight, we will only bring senseless death to everyone who has remained here. To the civilians, the women, the children. We cannot do this. The knights listened in shock. Finally, one French knight spoke. Grand Master, shall we let the Turks convince themselves of their victory? Philippe slowly nodded. Yes, but not the way they want. We will surrender the city with dignity, on our terms, and we will take everything valuable, the holy relics, the treasures of the order, the banners. The Turks can have the stones of Rhodes, but they will not have its soul. The negotiations lasted weeks. Sultan Suleiman, who respected the courage of the Hospitallers, offered surprisingly generous terms. The knights could leave freely with all their weapons, banners, and property. Local residents who wanted to stay could do so freely, and the Turks would not harm them. Those who wanted to leave could also leave freely. On a cold December day, an agreement was finally reached. Grand Master Philippe signed the treaty, although when he took the pen in his hand, contemporaries said that a tear rolled down his face. This was the first and only time anyone saw him cry. In the first days of the year, the Hospitallers began the evacuation. Slowly, with dignity, they left the city. First, they carried out the holy relics, including a piece of St. John's cross. Then the banners under which they had fought for centuries. Finally, the knights themselves came out in full armor with swords at their sides. Sultan Suleiman personally came to see them. When Grand Master Philippe passed by him, the Sultan bowed. "You are the bravest man in the world," he said. Philippe bowed back but did not speak. If this story has moved you and you want to know more about the greatest sieges of the Middle Ages and the heroic deeds of the knightly orders, do not hesitate. Subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share this video with everyone who loves history. In the comments, write what you think. Was Philippe's decision to surrender the right one? The departure of the Hospitallers from Rhodes did not mean the end of the order. Grand Master Philippe and his knights boarded ships and for 7 years wandered the Mediterranean, seeking a home. Finally, the Spanish king offered them the island of Malta, and there, in Malta, the Hospitallers rebuilt the order and for centuries more continued the fight against the Turks. But the memory of Rhodes never faded. The Hospitallers always spoke of Rhodes as a lost paradise. Their courage during the siege became legendary throughout Europe. Contemporaries said that 500 knights who faced 100,000 men was a deed worthy of the greatest ancient heroes. Sultan Suleiman, who conquered Rhodes, later said it was a victory that filled him with regret. "I am sad," he told one of his advisors, "that I forced this old man to leave his home. Such courage cannot be defeated, only temporarily stopped." Today, when we visit the island of Rhodes, the walls that the Hospitallers defended still stand. The bastions, although damaged in places, are still imposing. And if one stands on the walls long enough and listens to the wind, one can almost hear those cries that echoed here centuries ago. The commands of the knights, the battle cries of the janissaries, and the calm voice of Grand Master Philippe encouraging his men. The siege of Rhodes is a lesson for us today. It reminds us that courage is not about victory, but about standing up for what is right, even when we know that in the end we will lose. The Hospitallers knew they could not win. They knew Rhodes would fall, but they fought anyway, because that is what honor, faith, and chivalry demanded. The history of the Middle Ages is full of great battles, huge armies, and glorious victories. But few stories are as moving as the last battle of the Hospitallers on Rhodes. This is not a story about victory. It is a story about human perseverance, loyalty, and about how sometimes there is more glory in defeat than in victory. Grand Master Philippe later lived for more years in Malta, where he rebuilt the order. But it is said that every night he dreamed of Rhodes, of the walls where he stood with his knights, of the assaults when they repulsed the Turks, and of that moment when he looked back for the last time and saw the city before he left it. When he died, his last words were, "Rhodes, I never forgot. And indeed, the Hospitallers never forgot. Every year in Malta, and later in other places, they celebrated the memory of Rhodes. They told the story of the siege to new knights, so they would not forget what it means to be a Hospitaller. Today, centuries later, the siege of Rhodes still inspires us. It reminds us that true heroism is not always born on battlefields. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who know when to fight and when to withdraw with dignity. Grand Master Philippe and his knights fought for 7 months, and when they could fight no longer, they left with dignity. By this they showed that a Christian knight not only knows how to fight, but also how to decide wisely. And perhaps this is the most important lesson that the siege of Rhodes gives us: that human dignity does not depend on whether we won or lost, but on how we behaved in the struggle. The Hospitallers, even in their defeat, preserved their dignity, faith, and honor. And that is why history remembers them as one of the greatest knightly orders that ever existed.